right, y'all. We're gonna bring everybody together. So Josh, Sean, Trey, and Brent. Yep. Are you guys all on? Good. Excellent. Good. Uh, so what I want to do, so all of y'all have kind of had a moment in the spotlight. Really appreciate, where you're coming from. I really appreciate where you're coming from. This is not the kind of stuff we normally talk about at a space conference, right? Space conferences are all about PowerPoints and CGI of Martian settlements. Thanks a lot, Elon Musk. There's CGIs of elk in orbit. Thanks a lot, Blue Origin, for that O'Neill cylinder images, those O'Neill cylinder images. That's all aspirational, and it's pretty neat, and it is the kind of stuff that we like, right? I build space elevators for a living, right? You can only do that in imagery, and robots. We build a lot of robots, but this conference, the whole series of Blue Marble for the next year, that's not what this is about. This is all about, down here on the ground, right? We talk about strategic space from the perspectives of workforce. We talked about that a lot yesterday. Economics and industry, industrial base. We talked about that some early this morning, and then a lot yesterday. So all of these things are part of this spectrum, to use words all of y'all have used, I think, at some point today. Workforce, industrial base. These are the things that make the hardware, right? We all want to build hardware and things that actually live in the sky. And then we've got this emphasis on what y'all are doing, the actual strategy of being in Space Force, in the Air Force, the other services represented. So now I kind of just want this to be a bit of a free-for-all about y'all riffing off of the other person's comments, right? All of you had some nuance. All of you had some different flavors. There are some, disagreements. So let's flesh those out a little bit. Where would you say the most obvious disagreements are, and the most obvious concurrence?
I mean, never let it be said I'm not willing to jump in first. I would say that I think in hearing all of this, the most obvious point of agreement is that all of us agree that blue water is essential, and that it should be a significant portion of the Space Force's strategic mindset. I think that perhaps disagreement is maybe exactly in what form, fashion, or at what point should what be included. But I think that we could probably come to a fairly synonymous answer on that. But definitely, I think just the agreement that we need to, the Space Force shouldn't just be brown water. It needs blue water in there, and a significant portion of it to be able to be relevant for the next half century.
Roger.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I guess I'm coming at it from a practical standpoint, and you guys have hit upon it, right? The culture has to change in order for us to get to more of a blue water type of mindset. And practically, it's going to take a lot. It is very ingrained to support the terrestrial fight. And that's where the majority of the funding is going right now. It's going to be hard to answer Pete Gerritsen's question. What would it take to change? And it's going to take a lot of leadership, and not just from Space Force, which would be necessary, but Space Comm, which would also be necessary. but also from our national leadership. I mean, you can see it right now with the change in the administration. There is going to be I guess I would just say a less emphasis on Space Force, right? I think that's probably fair to say. And with that probably comes less funding. With less funding, less ability to do the things that we want to go and do. It's unfortunate, but I'm afraid that that's the way it's going to be. And, someone else had talked about having space vision move beyond administrations. And we just haven't been able to get there, unfortunately. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there will be some R&D money that can flesh out for space domain awareness and cislunar, or even some R&D money for inspector satellites out in L1 or something like that, which I would be hopeful for. I think that those would be fantastic little steps that could be taken in the FIDEP to help us get there.
I would like to riff on that if y'all don't mind. I tend to agree. We're not going to see a whole heck of a lot of money coming, but I don't know. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, because one thing that people haven't really, I think, realized is that the Air Force, thought of the Army Air Corps and the Army, the Air Corps before them, thought about what they were supposed to do as a service when there was no money at all, and relied almost entirely on civilian advances. And it was only, and they had a very, for so long, I've been focused on the relationship between the Navy and the Merchant Marine throughout, the centuries of naval history, and thought that symbiotic relationship was specific to the sea. But it really wasn't, because in Mitchell's writings in the 20s and 30s, he believed that there was this synergy between commercial and industry. It was only after World War II that the Air Force got big enough to crowd out, civilian airline purchases, to where during the Cold War, the Air Force got so much money, they didn't need to think about commercial anywhere near as much as they did in the past. And I think space is an awful lot like that. Still, if anything is going to happen, the military has to take the lead. The Space Force is going to be the ones that build these new systems and these new capabilities. And as much as I would love to see more, R&D for, advanced engines, and propulsion's a big deal with me, and stuff like that, that would be great. But the fact of the matter is, we probably have to realize that money is not going to open up for space until the commercial folks start scrambling out to everywhere. And then the government's going to have to play catch up of, hey, why the heck did you just let all those millionaires die on orbit, Space Force? Weren't you supposed to be able to protect those guys? What the heck are we paying you for? It's that kind of stuff. I think the Space Force could really learn to be lean and to be a partner rather than a purchaser. And supporting and supported relationships are not just for the terrestrial warfighters and the space warfighters. It's for whole of government, whole of nation. So I don't think we're going to see that leadership come from the U.S. government or Space Force leadership. I don't think. I think it's going to have to be the government's going to be dragged kicking and screaming.
All right. Sean, do you have any opening comments?
Nope. I think everyone said what I would say.
Right on. All right. Then I'd like to introduce our reporter for the afternoon. So thank you very much, Sandra Irwin. She's going to be joining us for this next hour, partly for this panel, and then with Lieutenant General Salzman in just a little while. Sandra, if you want to chime in, if you got a question, you're welcome to do whatever role you want to do.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. Apologize for jumping in late. I was busy with covering other events this afternoon. Unfortunately, it's, one of those weeks where they have multiple space events going on at the same time. But I'm interested in your discussion on funding because going back to Peter's question on, does the Space Force make people aware of what they do, and is that going to be a problem with funding? But if you look at the Space Force budget, what they got last year, which could be very much the same that they can expect to get this coming year, most of the money that they have is for technology. Like if from a $15 billion budget, $10 billion is for RDT&E. So it's a very technology heavy budget. So I'm curious, maybe you got some of you guys that are experts in this, maybe Brent or Josh, what would be, I mean, like if the Space Force was going to get more money, if the administration wanted to give them more money, what would be some of the investments that they should be making to get to this blue water capability that you're talking about? I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit more of the specific investments that you think could be made. Thank you.
I'll try to go first. Hold.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I have an obligation by Major Mercurio to make sure that I say that these are personal opinions. They do not represent the various governments that they're connected with. But this is an on the record report, so feel free.
Okay.
I just want to.
I will say that this complete, and I have academic freedom here, so I'll go out and say it, that this in continual bugging in for this disclaimer is exactly part of the cultural problem. Yeah, this isn't, I'm not wearing a uniform. No one else here is wearing a uniform. The Space Force needs to be a lot more thick-skinned about differences of opinion. But what the government should do, what the Space Force should do with the money they have, propulsion is the biggest thing. Access to space is something that everyone, civil, commercial, and government, can use. And that it's foundational to everything that happens in space. It's foundational for defense. It's foundational to defend spacecraft, for doing anything that's worth doing in space. And it would more or less equally benefit every sector. I think that would be it. But really, one of the things that might be more useful is to have the Space Force play its role in getting the other parts of government out of the way to let commercial do what they need to do to increase American space power in ways the Space Force does not have the budget to do yet.
And what are those parts of the government that are in the way?
I believe there was a couple of articles that were in your publications just a while back, but
Okay.
Beyond that, no comment.
Okay.
Not allowed to say that. So I would echo. There we go. Let me make sure I'm pointing to him, at least on mine. So I would echo Brent in saying that from his briefing, he highlighted that Space Force should be helping to invest in the SpaceX spaceship because it is a multi-purpose tool that once again has benefits for everyone, military and civilian. From my own personal perspective, I would also think that in-space construction is particularly important, and I think the Space Force should be looking at, particularly as it extends to lunar construction. And as comparison to that, China is currently working on 3D printing in low gravity. And the reason for that is that once you have the printer in space, you can then print structures. And so you don't have to bring an entire base to the moon. You just have the resources you can gain there and build it there.
Mm-hmm. How does the Space Force address all these issues that you're talking about in the context of requirements? Because you don't get funding if there are no requirements, and even minor things, even like the small launch industry, they're like, well, why aren't you buying more small launches? Well, because we don't have a requirement. all these things that you're talking about, they don't have a requirement. So is anyone looking at that? I mean, is there an opportunity to maybe do like non-traditional partnerships or types of procurements that are not the traditional requirements based?
So having written the research paper, you asked a great question, and this is where I, as a requirements lead in a couple jobs ago, I kind of had the opportunity to just kind of, as I was figuring out my own job, figure out who writes the requirements and what's the left of all that. And essentially, if the combatant command doesn't write the requirement in a, shoot, I just blanked on the name, but they capabilities development document, CDD, I think, or capabilities requirements doc. Anyway, they each combatant command, geographic and functional, publishes its own list of requirements based on inputs that are usually some form of report that are usually figured out through some type of wargaming or other kind of general high-level analysis that says this should be a requirement. And if those requirements aren't written and signed by the 4-star, then it's really not, it doesn't exist. I mean, for lack of a better term, it's just not given any kind of priority. So you can have other transaction authorities do things that aren't necessarily a hard requirement, but it won't get the advocacy that an actual requirement will. And that's always, and that's where it comes down to the funding and becoming a program of record. So if you are talking POM, every POM cycle is going to look at what is the actual requirement, and then it's going to rack and stack dollars against an actual stated requirement versus something that is not a requirement. So if it doesn't get stated, then it's not going to get that level of adequacy. So that's really big point number one. To Brent's point, the fact that we don't really have, as far as I know, thou shalt develop better propulsion as a requirement by US Space Command, I would agree. That's probably something that could very easily be listed as a, I would argue, dual use, like it benefits everybody. That should not be a very long conversation. There shouldn't be much analysis in let's make propulsion a requirement. Better propulsion is a requirement. A long-standing, it's always their requirement. And then same thing with construction, because we always want to get at better in-space construction and manufacturing of techniques so that we can build better hardware. Those two, I think, should be long-standing in US Space Command. Just like I think the other combatant commands probably assume, and maybe this is where, you know, the counterpoint is, does US PACOM or Indo-PACOM or EUCOM, do their individual components have something like, thou shalt make better aircraft carriers? Probably not. I mean, they probably have something the equivalent of thou shalt provide a capability that gets translated to an aircraft carrier or something like that. So I think as long as we just have a normal, again, normalized conversation of what does the requirement need to specify, and then the people who look at the requirements business understand what is behind that and what that means, then you can still have the advocacy underneath that. So to answer your question, yeah, it's just about figuring out what does the requirement need to state, and then who knows what that requirement actually means.
So if I could jump in, so the combatant command provides an integrated prioritization list of mission needs. It is called NIPL, and it goes up through the JROC, the Joint Requirements Council, I think it's Council, to then prioritize those things. But I will tell you that if you go and you ask the combatant commands, what is it that they need? They're not going to tell you they need better work on propulsion for spacecraft or for even for launch vehicles. They're going to tell you, I need better, more persistent ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance of whatever. I need better, persistent technical communications. I need, those types of things. And most of the time it's ISR. I need better command and control, right? So those types of things then get racked and stacked, and they get looked at. And in the past, what's happened is that the joint staff has looked at that and said, oh, PACOM needs more persistent ISR. Let's give them more aircraft. Let's allocate more of our low density, high demand aircraft to that AOR. And then it's done. Oh, hey, we met that requirement. And then the next year, the IPLs come up again and the same requirements there. And then the joint staff does the same thing. Well, shit, we gave them one more sortie last year. Let's give them another. And it still doesn't meet the requirement. But what was missing for the longest time, and that hopefully Space Force can fix, is the Space Voice. Hey, you know what? We can provide you with more persistent tactical ISR with Kestrel Eye, with imagery from that we purchased from Black Sky, from Harris L3's SAR capability, from ICEYE's capability, those types of things. I hope that will start happening in the next few years here. So that anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on that. To go back to your first question though, and this is going to probably throw a little, be a little bit controversial, but I would not give that money to Space Force. If I had extra money, I'd give it to the Department of Commerce and say, please go fix space traffic management. Take that off of the Department of Defense so the Department of Defense can focus only on those adversary things that we need to focus on. I mean, there is the man hours that we are spending at 18th Space Control Squadron in the back office trying to keep track and understanding where all the Starlinks are is ridiculous. It's that needs to be moved over to Department of Commerce, or if they change and make it go to the FAA, whatever, or Department of Transportation, whatever. But that needs to be funded. It needs to be funded tenfold where it is now. Right now, I think they got 15 mil for this year. It needs to be $150 million for them to go and figure out how to do this and take that burden off of the Department of Defense.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with that. But going back to the Space Force, I mean, you talk about space traffic management and ISR. Space Force wants ISR of the space domain. I think it was General Lauterbach, the Director of Intelligence for the Space Force. She said, I want to have awareness of the space domains, just like the Air Force has awareness of the air domain and so on. So do they need money to do that? What would be, how would the advocacy work to be able to get space domain awareness, the type of systems that they would need to do that, or the type of people that they would need to do that? Is that going to be a challenge, do you think?
It is. It's going to be a challenge because, even if you build the best whiz-bang ISR platform in space, you spend a lot of money to build that thing. You got to think about the tail end of it, the PED, the processing, analysis, and dissemination capability, the ground forces that have to look at the information. That's it's a expertise that has to be developed for the analyst. You've got to find those people. You've got to train those people. You also have to come up with the systems to look at it. Now, we may be able to use Air Force systems. That would be great. But they're going to have to spend a fair amount of money in standing that up. And I don't know where they're going to get that squadron from, because it's going to be a new group of people probably. They're not doing it now. So that's part of it. Then advocacy for just building the capability is going to have to happen too. I think you will get a help from that from the space, US Spacecom. They will probably have that as a list of mission requirements because it fits underneath their mission of space domain awareness. They have to have awareness of the AOR, battle space awareness. And the only way to do that is through space domain awareness. So I think that there'll be some mission need that will help Space Force start that effort, basically, to build a spacecraft and then all of the infrastructure that has to go along with it.
But of course, the step number one is going to be to hand over the public space traffic management functions to a civilian agency. And that seems to be moving so slow. I mean, do you have any sense if the Biden administration is going to have any appetite to take that on anytime soon?
I don't have any insight into the Biden administration is what they're going to do, but we do it now. I mean, Space Force manages the catalog now. They have been doing it since it began, so they can walk and chew gum at the same time. They'll also be able to work on space domain awareness. It's not one or the other. It would be fantastic if the Department of Commerce could step in and take over space traffic management. But until they do, rest assured that Space Force will continue doing that mission.
Well, one of the blue water insights, if I could just inject here pretty quick, is that,
Mhm.
GPS adds $1 to $1.5 billion in economic activity to the United States per day. That was from an economic impact report from a few years ago. And I will tell you one thing: the Space Force is the only service that pays for itself for a couple of times over, right? GPS adds more money to the American economy than the Space Force takes out by a lot. That needs to be pushed, because we do probably need to expand the Space Force to accommodate what's happening in space. And the Space Force cannot and should not, and hopefully cannot, back away from every fight over manpower because they feel they're the junior partner. We have to be aggressive in, doing our part to defend the nation and the world.
Okay.
I guess, hey, this is Floyd Kerr from Red Space. I guess I would add that when you ask where's the money going to go, what's the first step? My thought would kind of goes toward realistic exercises, realistic proof of concepts, and taking the tools and the machines that we know of, that we see, that we can touch, and getting them most accurately represented, thrown into a picture like Sean provided, and then run the numbers in so many iterations that we see all the different ways it could fail. And by just default of science and numbers, we can start seeing some of those paths. But until the COCOMs decide that they need to see that, they're not going to generate COCOM requirements, which are going to drive over the terrestrial COCOM requirements. So until Raymond says, hey, I'm a space COCOM, I'm threatened here, I don't know what China's doing on the other side of the moon. I need a sensor there 24/7, and I'm not going to put one of mine there. Some civilian company needs to go put it out there, just like they're doing for all the other stuff. So who's it going to be? So maybe he needs to say something like that. Maybe he has, I don't know, but that's the language that needs to be used from the combatant commander level in order for a Space Force to say, okay, boss, that's what you need. We'll go make you up some of that. Now we'll use our commercial integrated data, and we'll use our civilian companies, which, just real quick, that goes to the politics side of, am I going to push Boeing and Lockheed and these big companies that have, the architecture and the networks in place and the lobbying that goes on that keeps them those contracts, or are they going to take risks on new companies and go this way? So it's up to groups like this, I think, to bring up those points. I hope that helps. Over.
Yeah. I wanted to quickly follow up with Brent on the propulsion question, because doesn't Congress have language in the NDAA to do investments in future launch systems? I mean, I know the NDAA is not appropriations, but they have some language in there, and they're interested in, I mean, they see the Space Force, Air Force, SMC being a little too conservative in their approach to working with the launch industry. So do you think that maybe this Congress that we have now would be willing to look at that?
I apologize, ma'am. You're catching me off guard. I'm really not aware of too much about that. What I will say is that if the government wanted to get involved, it would definitely try to. I would advise that you try to bind interests together for mutual benefit, because quite honestly, if the Starship works and it's funded entirely by SpaceX, that is a win-win for everybody. But as far as more money from government, it has to be smartly done, because you can waste it pretty quick too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, SpaceX did try to get funding from the Air Force like 2 years ago, and they didn't, and then they took them to court and they lost. So the last thing we heard from SMC is that they're not interested in Starship, but I mean, things could change if they see success in the future. I don't know. I don't know what their latest thinking is, but that's been a little bit contentious.
Well, the cool thing about being an academic is you get to read a lot of history. And has this ever happened in the past? Every single time. Somehow the country is muddled through. I'm sure it'll muddle through this one. That doesn't mean that we don't have to fight for what we have to do, though.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for all your insight.
Thank you, all of y'all, for bringing your A game. I'm very grateful. Sandra, if you have any further follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to take your questions. I'm going to pop this briefly over to Ed, and then over to Bill, and then we'll bring on our distinguished guest, General Saltzman. Okay, I'm out.